I'm Jack Bobo. I used to work for the government, so I'm here to help you. And I know how warmly you all mean that when you laugh. It's a pleasure for me to be here. When I chose the name Futurity, it's a real word. It's not a made-up word, but it's just impossible to pronounce, it turns out. Not so good on my communication skills there. But it's important to think about the future and how we want to get there and what we want to achieve. And so I'm talking to you a little bit about, can agriculture save the planet? And I think we all believe that it can, but a lot depends on how we work together in order to achieve that future. Now, as of 3 months ago, I have a new hat that I'm wearing. I'm the Director of Global Food and Agriculture for the Nature Conservancy. And some of you will be familiar with the Nature Conservancy, some of you won't. The Nature Conservancy has owns 500,000 acres of grazing land, so it's an organization that's very involved in animal agriculture. It's been around since 1951. It's the world's largest conservation organization. And I joined because it's the kind of organization that needs to work with the ag industry in order to solve the problems we have. And so perhaps we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. Now, I spent 13 years at the State Department. Everywhere I went, people asked, well, what's the difference between what you do at State in ag and what they do at USDA? And I'd say, well, that's easy. At USDA, they do things, and at the State Department, we talk about doing things. And so I'm going to continue to talk about the things that people like you are doing every day. And so I appreciate that. But how we talk about things is really important as well. And I do have a little bit of experience with that. I was Chief Communications Officer for a company called Intrexon. Anybody ever heard of it? Yeah, that's because I was Chief Communications Officer. That's pretty much my fault. You may have heard of one of its subsidiaries, Transova Genetics. I think it's one of our sponsors today. But that was one of the companies, it was one of our subsidiaries. And so I had an opportunity to work with some really great people on animal ag there as well. So I want to start, though, by providing the context for this conversation around sustainability and the future of food. If we were to talk about land, 40% of all the land on Earth that could be used for agriculture is being used for agriculture today. The amount of cropland is the size of South America. The amount of pasture land is the size of Africa. So in terms of land, there's really nothing more important than agriculture. I think most of us would say the footprint is as large, if not larger, than we'd like it to be. So that's land. If we were to talk about water, this is the Aral Sea back in 1973, and if you fast forward to today, it's no longer a sea at all, and that's largely because of agricultural withdrawals of water. Now, these are not just problems in some distant places. 70% of all fresh water goes to agriculture, but the Colorado River, the fifth largest river in America, no longer flows to the sea. I think we've all been watching what's happening out west in terms of water availability. We're in the midst of a 1,200-year mega drought, and that's going to continue for some time. So these aren't the challenges of 2050. These are some of the realities that we're going to be dealing with today and tomorrow and for the foreseeable future. If we were to talk about climate change, 10 to 15% of all greenhouse gases come from agriculture, another 10 to 15% from deforestation, 80% of which is caused by ag. Now, most consumers think about energy policy and don't really talk much about ag policy, but for every dollar you invest in wind and solar, you get less than $1 back because they're less efficient than fossil fuels. Now, those are critical long-term investments for our future, but for every dollar you invest in agriculture, you get $1.43 back everywhere in the world, positive rates of return. So you have to wonder, would consumers rather pay more for their energy or less for their food to get a cleaner environment? Now, what I know of most Americans is they'd rather eat their way to a cleaner environment. I can say that because I don't work for the government anymore. So how do we get people excited about the opportunity presented by agriculture instead of critical of what it's producing? Now, just a couple of headlines you guys are all familiar with. The war in Ukraine, of course, is impacting supply chains. Countries like Egypt, the largest importer of wheat in the world, is most dependent on Russia and Ukraine for its imports. Dramatic impacts in many countries around the world. If we look at what's happening in terms of drought, severe drought in India, putting at risk, they thought they were going to be able to help meet some of that demand that's caused by disruptions in Ukraine, and now they're wondering what their own production is going to be. And so this is just the beginning of the season in places like India. So things are going to be getting worse there as well. Now, you know that we're going from 7.8 billion people on the planet to 9.5 or 10 billion people by 2050. So that's a challenge, this growing global population. But you probably also know that as many as 9 million people die every year of hunger. Now, it's hard for most people to wrap their minds around that fact, 9 million people. That's 25,000 people will die today of hunger. That's 1,000 people over the next hour will die of hunger. That's one person every 4 seconds. And it's mostly children. Now, there's not a single person who wouldn't go to help that child if they saw them. But they often don't see them because they're other places, or it's hidden hunger, or people don't want to talk about it. And so we need to talk about it, though, because these are important issues that people need to be aware of. It's real and it's important. Now, 800 million people or more are going to bed hungry today. Now, 2 years ago, that number was about 650 million. So COVID and these other crises have really driven that number up. It had been declining for decades, and now it's on the rise. So it's, again, something that we need to be aware of. It's something we need to be concerned about. In this day and age, it's really unacceptable that 800 million people would be going to bed hungry. And this is part of the reason that I think many people feel like our food system is broken. I mean, I'm sure you've heard that a lot. Our food system is broken. People are going to bed hungry. But it also sort of begs the question, if the food system is broken, when was it not broken? Was it not broken last year? Was it not broken 10 years ago? You know, if things are broken, usually that means they were better in the past. But if you look at the past and you see how did we get here or where are we, it's very different. Yes, 10% of all the people on the planet are going to bed hungry, and that's completely unacceptable. But 20 or 30 years ago, that would have been about 20% of all the people on the planet would have been going to bed hungry. And 50 or 60 years ago, about 30% of all the people on the planet were going to bed hungry. So I would suggest that things are not bad and getting worse. They're good and getting better, but not fast enough. And that's a major difference. How we frame this conversation is critically important. When you tell people they're the problem, it's very hard to convince them that they need to work with you in order to solve it. When you tell them that they're part of the solution and we would like to help you and support you and allow you to do a better job, you know, that's a different way of approaching the conversation. Again, if we looked at child mortality, you know, dramatically lower than at any point in human history. So things are not bad and getting worse. They're good and getting better, but not fast enough. Now, I try to explain to a lot of audiences and a lot of conservation audiences, you know, they see the problems of agriculture. They see eutrophication of waterways. They see deforestation. They don't. And I say, well, you know, what if we looked at, you know, just a bushel of corn, the resources necessary to produce that in the United States? Well, between 1980 and 2011, farmers produced 35% fewer greenhouse gas emissions to produce that bushel. There is 40% less land needed to produce that bushel. There is 40% less energy that goes into it. There's 50% less water. And there's 60% less erosion to produce that. So by every single measure, things are getting better. Now, we could show the same charts for canola and cotton and soy and whatever crop you want. Things are not bad and getting worse. They're good and getting better. But of course, the problems persist, not because we're not doing better, but because we're producing even more. The demands are growing. And so in order to meet that demand, there are more impacts. But the impacts are because of increased production, not because things are being produced in a way that's getting worse. It's better, but not fast enough. Now, one of the challenges that we face is how we talk about sustainability and how consumers think about it versus how growers or companies think about sustainability. For most consumers, they think, you know, if you produce food using less water, less fertilizer, less insecticide, well, that sounds more sustainable. And it probably is for that farm. If you have fewer inputs, it's better for the farm. That's what I call local sustainability, because the benefits of using less inputs are felt locally. The problem, though, is, of course, if you use less fertilizer, water, and insecticides, you will produce less food, because there is a reason that farmers are using those inputs. And if you produce less food and demand stays the same, somebody else must step up and fill the gap, and that is usually someplace else. And so it's driving impacts globally. So the benefits are local, but the impacts are global. On the other hand, if you produce food more intensively, the benefits are global because you're actually reducing indirect land use change in other places. But the impact on that farm is probably greater. So the impacts are local and you can see it, but the benefits are global and hard to point to. And so it's not that one is right or wrong, it's that it's a continuum from local sustainability to global sustainability, and there will always be trade-offs between the two. Now, if we were to look at Europe right now, their farm-to-fork strategy, though, it's calling for reduced pesticides and reduced fertilizer use and 25% organic by 2030. But it's not saying while maintaining production. And so all of these things will reduce the impact of agriculture on Europe. But it will also mean that Europe does not produce maybe 8 to 10% as much food. Well, the country that sends the most food to Europe is Brazil, and Brazil is the largest rate of deforestation in the world. So Europe is exporting its agricultural footprint to arguably the most biodiverse country on the planet. That might not be a good idea. Now, it's really about choices and consequences. And we need to find ways of explaining these consequences so that we can have a better conversation. Now, Europe could have said, we want to reduce the use of fertilizer and insecticides and other things while maintaining and growing production through innovation. It could be a very different conversation, because innovation is really how we got to the point we are, where we are today. And it's important. Because if you look at agriculture since 1960, the amount of land has grown, but not a lot compared to the amount of improvements or growth in production. We produce wildly more food than we did in 1960 on pretty much the same amount of land. And because of the growth in production, it's growing faster than the population, and that's why hunger has declined over time. Now, there are about 3 billion hectares of forest on the planet today. And if we were farming today the way we did in 1960, we would need 1 billion of those hectares to meet the current demand for food. So think about that. More than a quarter of all the forest on the planet only exist because of innovation and improvement in management practices. But nobody can identify the forests that didn't get cut down. You only look at the ones that did. And so it's hard to wrap our minds around the fact that while agriculture may be the biggest driver of deforestation, it is also the greatest savior of forests. And we need more of the innovation, not less, in order to get us where we want to be. So I like to think of sustainability not as a destination, but as a journey. Agriculture today is wildly better than it was 30 years ago, and it will be wildly better 30 years from now, but it will continue to improve into the future. There's no such thing as sustainable agriculture. There's just more sustainable. If we're doing better this year than we did last year, we're on the right journey. You know, when I think about it, in many ways, farmers and ranchers have been on this journey for over 100 years. And now the public is just catching up to the importance. The difference is that in the past, you probably talked about sustainability as innovation equals efficiency and improved management practices. But that's what sustainability is. All of those things that have been done so that you could have a better farm, a better ranch, have improved the sustainability of your operation and have contributed to the place that we are today. How we talk about things matters. The language is what's important. So I want to give a couple examples of different trends, though, and how people think about them and how they misunderstand some of these trends. So one of the things I found interesting is you see a lot of reports that millennials are the most open to these alternative proteins, that they're very accepting of them. You don't often hear about the fact that millennials consume meat at the highest rate of any demographic group. So, those two things can be true at the same time. People can be open to new things, and they can be perfectly happy with old things. And so understanding the trends, we hear the headlines, but we miss the details often because they don't make the news. You may have heard Bill Gates, comments about synthetic meat in his book that, everybody will be eating it by 2030. I like to say, what he doesn't know about science communication would fill a book. I know, I wrote it. And, I don't know anybody who wants to eat synthetic meat, but they might be willing to do it, but how you talk about things matters. And how do we get to that future that people want to live in? There's another report out, Rethink X, that talks about the collapse of the livestock industry by 2030. Again, they don't understand economics and they don't understand consumers. And that's important because we need to understand how to talk to consumers because it's important. Now, just a little bit of the background. Today, by 2030 or by 2050, we need to produce between 50 and 100% more protein than we do today. That's a lot. That's almost, that's doubling the amount of protein production. And it's a $2 trillion industry today, so that's a $1 or $2 trillion opportunity. For the sake of argument, let's say that, the alternative protein grows into a $1 trillion market by 2050, which would be, amazing growth. Well, that would not impact a single head of cattle anywhere in the world. Now, the question, though, is, do we want to get to 2050 by doubling the number of animals in livestock production by 2050? That might not be the right balance either. We probably need to find new ways of meeting that future demand, but that doesn't have anything to do with what we're producing today. It is a growing pie. And the question is not whether or not livestock will shrink. The question is, how much will it grow? How much of an opportunity will be met by your improvements in sustainability to be able to do that better versus other alternatives coming along that are able to meet that demand in a sustainable way? So it's a competition over who could be most sustainable, not who's going to exist. Now, we have these competing views, though, of how our food system should look. On one hand, we have this slow food movement that says we should be producing food the way it was produced 100 years ago. And on the other hand, we have this sort of high-tech version of what the future of food is going to look like. And in many ways today, they're kind of moving in different directions. And this is a problem because it's dividing people. And we really need to find a way of bringing these two tracks together. Now, I like to say that people love innovation almost as much as they despise change. And there is no place people despise change more than in the food they eat. Because food is what brings us together with friends and family. And if you mess with my food, you are messing with my family. And people don't like that. But if we don't change how we produce food, everything will change. So we have to figure out, how do we talk about and make these changes in a way that excites the public as opposed to turning them off? And that, again, comes back to communication. How we talk about things matters. I also like to say that consumers have never cared more nor known less how their food is produced. And that's a real problem, though, because consumers care passionately about it, and then they ask for changes to the food system because they care. But because they don't have any real understanding or knowledge of it, the things they ask for may not get them what they want. And, that's even more of a problem, that, consumers want a sustainable future, and then they ask for things that are going to make food less sustainable. I think we kind of see that in Europe, that the farm to fork strategy is intended to create a more sustainable world, but it's really just exporting their impact someplace else. And that's probably not what most Europeans actually want. They want this actually improve the planet, not just improve Europe. How do we talk about that so people get it? So it's important for us to remember that science tells us what we can do, but it's the public that tells us what we should do. And if we can't connect to the public and make the case that we're the right product or the right industry in order to deliver that, then even if you're able to deliver that sustainable future, you will not get the opportunity. The public has to trust us to do it. I used to spend a lot of time talking about risk when I was in the government and trying to explain to people. The problem is that none of us are really hardwired to understand risk unless we're statisticians, and nobody wants to talk to a statistician, right? So how do you do it? So I used to try to use this example. I'd say, well, that shark in the ocean is a hazard, but if you don't have any exposure, if you're not in the water, well, it's not a real risk. You go swimming, and now all of a sudden that exposure and that hazard together creates a risk. Again, we're not hardwired to understand risk. Somebody says something can cause cancer, and people think it causes cancer. It's like, no. It never causes cancer in the real world. It's just that in theory, it can. Doesn't matter. You can't unring that bell. So what I eventually realized I should be talking about is hazard times media exposure equals perception of risk. And that's what most of us are dealing with most of the time, is perception of risk. And in order to address perception of risk, it requires a completely different set of skills and engagement than dealing with actual risk. Actual risk is food scientists figuring out root causes and addressing risk. Perception of risk, somebody says something on the internet and it passes around the world, and all of a sudden people are worried about something in their food, and that has nothing to do with actual risk. Or it may or may not. The fact is you just don't know. There are a lot of things that consumers worry about. On the other hand, there are a lot of things they should worry about. And there's very little correlation between what consumers worry about and what they should worry about. The correlation is between what they worry about and what they hear on TV, they read about on the internet. That's what determines what people worry about. And so again, we need to be engaged in the places where people are talking about things. So we need to find ways, though, of making people less concerned about some of these issues. And so how do we do that? Well, one example I like to use is, some of you have heard this idea, if you can't pronounce the ingredients in a food, you shouldn't eat it. Have you guys heard that? It kind of drives the scientist in me crazy, and so you want to beat people up with the science to explain to them how stupid they are, which apparently doesn't work very well. So what I like to do is I show this chart that shows the ingredients in food. And it turns out there are all sorts of things in food that I can't pronounce. Now, my wife has a PhD in molecular biology, and she can pronounce these things, but that doesn't matter. Most of us can't. And what happens, though, you show this image, and people kind of laugh, and they get it, that there are lots of things they can't pronounce. And so it's the difference, though, between beating somebody up with science and leading them to knowledge. People actually enjoy learning things. They go on the internet, they watch TED Talks about things they really have no specific interest in, but it's just very well delivered. A great presentation, can get you to listen to something and learn about something that you didn't think you were interested in at all. How we communicate is critically important to whether or not people will listen or believe us. Now, something that I've added to some of my presentations about shifting diets, and I think a lot of the audiences that I talk to, it's something that's a little uncomfortable. I talked to the pork industry conference last year and the reciprocal meat conference and others, and when they hear it, I think they feel like it's somehow an attack on animal ag, but I think that we need to be part of this conversation. Because 42% of Americans are obese, 75% of Americans are overweight or obese, and that number will be 50% by 2030 if we do not change the trajectory. So there is something that we need to be engaged in because this is an important part of the conversation. And so it's not something we need to shy away from. But there's a difference between shifting diets for sustainability reasons and for our health. And so we need to be in part of the conversation so that we can, determine where that conversation goes. So we need to be able to talk about it. And just to put that into context, in 1975, there was basically no country on the planet that had an obesity rate above 15%. Today, there's virtually no country on the planet that has an obesity rate below 15%. So it's not a particularly American problem. It's actually, we're winning this race, unfortunately. But before the 1970s, the obesity rate in America was generally lower than in most places in Europe. And so, this is a problem that's really grown in just the last, 50 years. And that's what I talk about in my book is how did we get there? How did psychology change? How did our food environment change? And what would it take in order to make healthy outcomes the default? But a lot of that came out of my conversations in meetings like this, understanding consumer psychology. Now, a lot of what we see in things like alternative proteins come back down to something called the halo effect, which is like, all of a sudden, if something has one good quality, we just assume it has many good qualities. And for the obesity epidemic, when somebody gave you a consumer a low-fat cookie, they're like, that's great. If one low-fat cookie is good for me, the entire bag, that's going to be great. And so, companies provided these alternatives thinking they were helping consumers out, and our brains messed with us and screwed it all up. You cannot trust your brain. That's one important thing to remember from this presentation. But you see it, though, with alternative proteins all the time. 95% of consumers say they're eating alternative proteins, Beyond Burger and other things for health reasons when it's not necessarily healthier at all. And so there's a mismatch between why people do things and why they should be doing things that actually ultimately undermines products like that. Another challenge that we have is mental fatigue or decision fatigue. And, it's hard to make healthy choices. The International Food Information Council, IFIC, they did a poll of people and they asked about how hard it is to make healthy food choices. And more consumers think it's hard to eat healthy than it is to do their taxes. And that's kind of sad because it should not be that complicated to eat a healthy meal, to have a healthy diet. Our parents and our grandparents were cooking with lard and Crisco, and somehow they weren't obese. It's like you think about the diets that we had as kids, and it has a lot to do with our environment, not necessarily the food products. But when it comes to decision fatigue, there's no place harder to make healthy choices than a grocery store. The average grocery store today has about 10,000 more products than a grocery store in 1980. And that just creates a lot of decision fatigue because the more decisions you have to make when you're tired, or the worse your decisions are. So when you're tired, you make bad choices. When you have lots of choices, you make bad choices. So again, it's getting harder, and we need to find a way to help fix that. Another problem that comes up is something called confirmation bias. We've all seen it in others. We're all very, very good at identifying confirmation bias in other people. We are perhaps not quite as good at seeing bias in ourselves. So I like to give an example of my own bias. So if I were to read a newspaper article that said, organic agriculture is more nutritious than conventional agriculture, I'd ask, who are the authors? Who funded the research? And what was their methodology? Now, those are pretty reasonable things to ask, I think. But what if the article said, organic, no more nutritious than conventional? What am I going to do? I'm going to tweet it, right? I mean, it's consistent with what I believe. I'm sure they're fine. I'm sure the funding source was okay. That's what bias looks like, and it's so hard to see. You could think, aha, these people are biased. This guy worked on an organic farm when he was in high school. And you're like, I proved that guy wrong. He's biased. And it's like, no, that's me. And so it's important because if we don't begin to sort of try to understand our own biases, it's really hard to talk to other people about theirs. And so we need to sort of look inward as well in order to have better conversations. The availability heuristic is just a complicated way of saying what things come to mind when I say a word. So like when I say the word natural, you guys thinking rainbows and butterflies and puppies? Or are you thinking salmonella, E. coli, and COVID? They're all natural too, right? But our mind goes to this happy place when we see the word natural. When you do surveys, the word natural is far more convincing to a consumer than the word organic on a label. It's like, well, organic or natural? Ooh, I'll take the natural one. That doesn't mean anything. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I don't know, but I'm still choosing it. So, it has this big impact on people's decisions. And so it's important, though, to understand how the psychology works and the language we use in order to engage with people. It's important. So, I've already mentioned that, we need 50 to 60% more food by 2050. We need to maybe 50 to 100% more protein. So these are just challenges that we're facing. And One of the things I found interesting, though, is when I look at data from the World Resources Institute that talks about how do we get to that sustainable future, they spend a lot of time talking about diet shifts and reduced food waste and lots of things that are all very important to talk about. But what they seldom talk about is the green bar, and that's like a really big green bar. And what that green bar is that 2/3, 61%, of the improvement we need to get to a sustainable future is baked into their analysis based on historic improvements, business as usual. So think about that. 2/3 of what we want to achieve to get to that sustainable future will happen if conservation groups did nothing. And that's you improving efficiency and farm practices and management practices every day simply because it's the right thing to do. 2/3 of the sustainability goals are what you will do no matter what. And instead of blaming producers for not doing the last third, we should be thanking them for getting us 2/3 of the way there and asking them, what can we do to help get you across the finish line? And that's a lot of what the Nature Conservancy is doing when it engages with ranchers and others, is how can we work together to accelerate that sustainable future? What you would have already done by 2050, well, if we can help you, maybe you can do it by 2030. Wouldn't that be great for all of us? So we need to recognize that, conventional ag delivers most of the gains that we need, and how can we help do it better? Again, how we frame this conversation. How do we get people excited about that possibility? How do we help them to understand that the words that people use really matter? So often when I'm talking to conservation organizations, they talk about what agriculture should do. But why can't we just talk about what you could do? The opportunity. Nobody likes to be told what to do, especially those of us with children, right? But you frame it in a different way, all of a sudden it becomes an opportunity. How we talk about things matters. All of us need to become better storytellers. I know you've heard this a lot. We need to be able to help personalize these messages, though. So often when I talk to scientists, they immediately jump into what they're doing. They talk about gene editing or genetic engineering or whatever, because they're really excited about it. But they seldom stop to talk about why they got into science, why they got into ranching or farming. And it's usually because they want to make a difference. They want to have a positive impact on the planet. They all have a really great story, and they just don't tell it. So we need to personalize our messages. We need to be able to acknowledge people's concerns. I spent 13 years at the State Department talking about GMOs, and I heard a lot of the people that I work with talk about how people are becoming more and more anti-science. And I have to tell you, I didn't meet a single person in 13 years who was anti-science. I met a lot of people who didn't trust the government, and they didn't trust big business, but they all love science. They just didn't trust me. And that's a very different point. And if you tell somebody they're anti-science, that's the end of the conversation, because they don't believe it, and it's probably not actually true. But if you ask them why don't they like GMOs or whatever it might be, it's because they're worried about the health and safety of their families. And I don't know anybody who's not worried about the health and safety of their family. That's a pretty good reason to be concerned. So if we can begin to connect with people based on our shared values, that's the moment we have an opportunity to build trust. And it's only when you have trust that you can talk about science. Science, at the beginning of a conversation, merely polarizes the audience. Those who agree with you agree more, but those who disagree more as well. We need to start with trust, and we need to focus on how to build it. So a few thoughts to leave you with. One is how we frame the conversation. Things are good and getting better, not bad and getting worse. We need people to understand that. There aren't any perfect solutions. There will always be trade-offs. And we need the public to understand the impacts of the choices that they're making. We need to change the language that we're using. You know, that's part of the reason that I joined the Nature Conservancy. I mean, what I tell people my personal mission is to de-escalate the tension in our food system so that we can all get about our business of saving the planet our own way. I don't know what the right solution is going to be, but I think if we're all trying our best, it will probably turn out to be a part of all of the things that people are doing. We need more than one solution. We need all of the solutions. How we communicate matters, and that it's only through personalizing our own stories and telling it ourselves that we're going to make a difference. And I think that that has a lot to do with why people are more trusting of agriculture today. I think they appreciate it more. The last 2 years have been hard, and they've reminded people why farming and ranching is so important. And so I think that's an opportunity to build on as we go forward. So as I draw to a conclusion, I want to talk about why this particular moment in time really matters. Now, we've already talked about going from 7.5 to 9.5, 10 billion people, so that's a challenge. But I want to imagine for a moment that we actually get to 2050, and we get there without cutting down our forests, without draining our rivers, our lakes, and our aquifers. Well, at that moment, think about where population is going. Population is going to level off dramatically after 2050. And the reason is we're not having more kids. The number of kids born this year will be the same as the number of people born next year or the year after, and it's actually slowly going to decline. 100% of population growth to 2050 is because people are living longer. 100%. But then population starts to slow. So imagine for a moment, though, that we get to 2050 and productivity continues to rise. Well, for the first time in human history, we won't need dramatically more food. We will be able to take all of those productivity gains and use them to reduce the impact of agriculture on the planet. For the first time, we will see the benefits of productivity gains in terms of water and land and all sorts of things. So we have this huge opportunity after 2050. It is harder to feed the world every single day between now and 2050. It will be easier to feed the world every day after 2050. So the challenge we have is not to do better and better forever and things are always going to get worse. The challenge is to get to 2050 without screwing things up. If we do, in many ways, we will be good forever. So, the next 30 years are not just the most important 30 years there have ever been in the history of agriculture, and they are. They're the most important 30 years there will ever be in the history of agriculture. And that's why we need to get it right, and that's why this particular moment in time is so important. Because if we get it right, agriculture can, in fact, save the planet. And that's what I'm betting on, and that's why I'm here to talk to you about what you're doing to see how I can help you to save the planet. Thank you very much. So we have time for any questions?
Yeah, I think we have a little bit of time for questions. And on your app, I forgot to mention at the beginning that you can actually ask questions through the app. And Hannah in the back is the voice of the app. So when you hear Hannah's voice, that means that's where the question came from.
And we have one.
But she also has a microphone, so Hannah, go ahead.
So we do have a question, again, from the app. The question is, if animal ag can come together to save the planet, who is going to lead that effort?
So I think that, one, lots of people need to be part of this. There's not going to be one organization that's going to fix the problem for you. You know, we need to do this together. But I do think organizations like this need to work with across the aisle. They need to work with conservation and others. Last month I spent some time in Rome. I met with the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Food Program, EFAD and CG and others. And what really struck me is that they wanted to talk to the Nature Conservancy because they wanted to help agriculture to improve its conservation goals, to become more environmentally friendly, because that was going to be good for the farmers and ranchers they worked with. They wanted the land not to be used good just today, but to be good into the future. And of course, the conservation organizations want to work in ag because our view is if you can sustainably and nutritiously feed people, they will not go into the forest and cut them down. And so we're sort of moving towards the same place. And so it's organizations like this working with organizations that believe that agriculture can help save the planet to get to that right spot more quickly. So you can help conservation groups to talk about this in a better way, and hopefully we can help you to understand that there's also a balance that achieves all of our goals. So it's a collaboration.
Yep, and if you have a question, we do have a mic runner. So question right up here.
And I'll be sticking around a little bit after this, so you can always grab me in the hallway as well.
Okay. Right here. Second table back.
And I'm very sorry you left Indiana, my home state.
I loved Indiana, but let me tell you, it's great being home.
Thank you for the presentation today. One question that we both kind of have is, how does food waste play into this conversation about sustainability and the future of our food?
Yeah, I mean, sustainability or food waste is really important, and if we could get our arms around it, it would really make everything easier. But, food waste is not one problem, it's 1,000 problems. Food waste for potatoes is different for bread, it's different for apples, and so, it's like comparing apples and oranges, right? So we need to work on all those things, but, 40% of food waste is post-consumer, and so, no matter what you do, that doesn't address that. And, I think about how food waste has changed during my lifetime. When I was growing up, my mom would cut the fat off of the steak before putting it on the grill, and then later on it was the butcher who did that, and, now, that happens before it ever leaves the plant. And so, a lot of that has then, with renderers and others, become products. And so, things are really much better than they ever have been. But if we can get our arms around that, that would have a really big impact. And some of that's education. Consumers think, a Best Buy label is a safety issue as opposed to a quality issue. And, so we have to unlearn a lot of things that we learned in our lifetimes. And, that's a challenge. So critically important, but it's alone not going to solve the problem.
We have one
question right over there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Any studies that have you done on urban sprawl, and how much urban sprawl has eaten up farm ground, tillable acres as well as acres that should be able to be pastured?
So I have, and I think the World Resource Institute has looked at that, and it is a relatively small amount, urban land. Now the problem is that sometimes it impacts some of the best land. Because people put cities in places for reasons, and those cities, it's because they're surrounded by good agricultural land. But urban sprawl, is a small part of the problem, but it's still part of the problem. And cities are pretty efficient. So if you grow up instead of out, you actually reduce the environmental footprint per person pretty dramatically. But that also leads to people moving away from rural areas, and so there are trade-offs between all of these things. But it's a small part. But I see it where I live in Potomac, Maryland. It used to be all farm country, and now it's mostly suburban Washington D.C. So.
Jack, to wrap things up, a lot of times when you think about some of the messaging and some of the things that we hear from consumers, animal ag is often villainized. But now, it's agriculture is the solution. So, what's that delicate balance there, and maybe what type of words should we stay away from, and so that people understand that agriculture, and especially animal agriculture, isn't the villain. We can be part of the solution, and we've already made significant improvements the past decade.
So one thing to remember is that consumers really like animal ag products, and so when people send messages out there that animal ag is bad, in many ways, it undermines them anyway, because, it creates something called cognitive dissonance. It's like, if animal ag is evil and I really like my bacon, that makes me evil, so I guess they're wrong, right? So you go out and eat a double quarter pounder, when somebody says that. And so it creates dissonance, which creates reactance. Reactance turns consumers the other way. But, we want to try to avoid that on both sides. So, one of my claims to fame is I'm the person who killed the term clean meat for the cultivated or lab-grown meat sector. I worked with that industry for 10 months and convinced all the companies to stop using it, because it was just making it harder to have conversations with people. When one side is saying you're evil, that's just not a good place to start. But it's also not necessarily good when the livestock industry attacks these other products as being ultra-processed, because you're the incumbent, you're the large player, and so one, it draws more attention to the other products, and two, it makes it look like you're worried. And so I was working with the dairy industry when some of the alternative ice cream came out. And my recommendation to them with how to respond to things like Perfect Day ice cream was to say, we're very interested to hear about this development. We believe it validates the nutrition of dairy proteins. We believe that consumers will continue to be interested in the full range of proteins in a glass of milk. And we feel like we're on trend with a wholly natural product. Elevate your product. Don't try to undermine the other. And I think you end up in a better place because both sides need to do it. We actually need all of these products. And, if consumers are less confident in our food system, none of us benefit. And, right now there's a real lack of confidence.
All right, let's give Jack a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you.